Chapter 18, Act 18, Harley's Tale. Act 18, Harley's Tale. The fever pitch. Edward's declaration had put the Chancellor in the throes of a horrific fit. After 15 minutes of trying to convince Edward not to go to Baron, he finally threw his hands in the air and let out a sigh of resignation that filled the entire throne room. All Harley could do was watch in amazement. She couldn't get a word in even if she wanted to, and she couldn't remember the last time Edward had actually won a fight with the Chancellor, frequently as they argued. Perhaps the world was really going to end, after all.
You must bring guards, at the very least.
Edward shook his head.
No, I do not want to involve the military with such haste. If you are worried about starting something with Baron, that would certainly be a good way to go about it. But, my lord, I cannot in good conscience allow you to travel to Baron completely unescorted. With the meteor, and now this moon. It's practically falling onto one's sword, if you ask me.
Edward pressed his fingers to his forehead. If he resisted, the Chancellor probably would just end up sending soldiers to tail him anyway, and then he would have to pretend to not notice them, and they would have to pretend it wasn't their most ridiculous job yet until they all awkwardly just happened to meet at the docks. Why bother going through the pretense?
Very well. I will leave the specifics up to you.
The Chancellor muttered something incomprehensible, immediately turning to Amy, Toby, and Joe, who had been standing silently throughout the entire ordeal, trying not to look at each other for fear of laughing.
Guards. You will serve as His Majesty's escort on the journey to Baron.
Sir. They chanted simultaneously. This was turning out to be a hell of a day.
Let us depart immediately, Edward said. We should make as much of our journey in the daylight as we can. It will be a long road without use of the hovercraft to get to the Capo Desert.
And if I have to be honest, I might lose my nerve too.
What happened to the hovercraft?
The Chancellor blanched, and Harley cleared her throat.
It's been in need of repair for some time. It's just fallen to the bottom of the list in terms of financial priorities. Ridiculous,
the Chancellor shook his head.
Well, while you're down in Baron, bring that lunatic Sid back here to repair it. It's the least he could, since his king is putting us through this mess. Very diplomatic, Chancellor,
Harley sneered, pushing past him to follow Edward out.
Perhaps it's you we should be worried about starting a war. You're blind if you don't think war has already reached our shores, Harley.
The Chancellor called out. But she had let the throne room door slam behind her, tuning out his warning. Harley and the royal guard kept a few steps behind Edward as he silently made his way through the great hall toward the courtyards that would lead them outside. Normally, he wandered about with a friendly smile on his face and a greeting for every person who passed him by, but something about the look in his eyes that morning made the castle residents do a double take and resist engaging him. Harley tried to make up for it by offering up a forced smile of her own, but no one was paying much attention to her. She knew the castle residents were probably starting to put two and two together, the return of the moon, the sudden appearance of a red-winged ship, and Edward's visible uneasiness made for an unsettling pall that had swiftly fallen over the castle. At the entryway, Edward at last turned to Harley, resting his hand on her shoulder gingerly.
Well, this is where we part ways.
What? Harley shook her head quickly.
No, my lord. I am going with you.
She said it as casually as one would announce that they were running to the market for bread. Edward laughed softly. Like he had really expected her to react any other way?
I am afraid I cannot permit that.
She waggled her finger.
I am your secretary, my lord. If you are going to have a diplomatic meeting with the King of Baron, it is my duty to be present.
Edward blinked. She had gotten him there. But I have the feeling this isn't going to be very diplomatic, is what he wanted to say, but even just the thought made him feel guilty, as if he were already betraying Cecil. Harley raised her chin.
I am certain I will prove useful, your highness.
Edward knew that was her polite way of saying
I will outwit and outsmart any meager comeback you have until you give up, so stop wasting our time and let's get on with it. Very well,
Edward sighed, and Harley smiled sweetly in return.
I will make sure not to burden you too much on this trip.
He nodded, turning toward the flower bed that contained the whisperweed and an abundance of other blooms. He pulled out several stems that had just started to blossom, and then moved to another flower bed, plucking a few more flowers that made for a more eye-catching bouquet. Unraveling one of the leather laces from his vest, he tied it around the flowers and gently tucked them into his belt.
My lord.
Harley blinked.
A small gift for Cecil,
Edward replied, but the dullness of his eyes didn't match the labored smile on his lips. With the hovercraft out of commission, the party had no choice but to cross the underground waterway that stood between Damcyan Castle and Capo, where the docks were stationed that would take them to Baron. Long before any of them had even been a thought, the waterway had been a popular trade route and was made relatively safe by the constant coming and going of both soldiers and merchants, which kept the monster populations at bay. But during Edward's parents' reign, Capo had become a stronger market on its own thanks to being brought into the fold of the Damcyan territories, and as a result, many people no longer needed to cross between the two as frequently. The invention of the hovercraft permitted the royal family ease of travel using the shallows of the western seas, which meant soldiers also no longer needed to patrol the waterway as often for monsters. When adding in the rising popularity of using ships for travel, eventually the route fell under disrepair, and only the desperate or unlucky needed to slog their way through to reach the other side of the continent. Edward and Harley had never set foot in the waterway that was only steps from the castle in which they lived, but luckily their company of guards had spent plenty of time within as part of their training and were able to lead the way. As they descended deeper into the series of caverns, which would take them underneath a waterfall and eventually deposit them back on the surface, where they would need to cross through yet another route under the mountains that protected Capo's northern border, Edward would strum his harp quietly, sometimes humming along and other times letting the notes shine on their own. Harley had heard rumors that Edward knew songs that could have an adverse effect on monsters and fae, but she had never seen it for herself until now. As Amy, Toby, and Joe hacked their way through clusters of undead, Harley would notice that every once in a while, a healing light would manifest itself from the sky, disguised in the trailing sunbeams that managed to break through some of the cavern's depths, and burn the flesh of the monsters they encountered. Edward would strum his harp silently, a small smile on his lips as a matching light imbued on the harp strings slowly faded away with the end of a song. He's stronger than he lets on, Harley thought to herself. He stays hidden in the background, so slight of movement that you would forget he was even there, despite the somber melody of his harp that besieges the battlefield. Why does he remain in the shadows when it only encourages the rumors that he lacks courage and conviction? If people understood the power of his music, would they realize that that very power had to come from a soul that was the embodiment of tenacity? She realized that despite nearly 17 years living under the same roof, the longest time she had spent with anyone in her life, she still didn't entirely understand him. Maybe he doesn't even understand himself? Hours later, having made it through the first stretch of the waterway, it felt beyond glorious to emerge into the sunlight and early summer warmth. Edward and Harley sat in the grass as Amy, Toby, and Joe wandered into the next cavern to get a jump on any monsters that might be waiting for them. Harley wondered if 3 youngsters like them got bored babysitting herself and Edward. She felt terribly ancient compared to them, even if she was still only in her 30s.
Did you assist Cecil in battle with your harp as you were doing just now with the guards?
Harley asked, and Edward blinked in surprise.
Ah, so you noticed.
She nodded.
Well, I did my best, at any rate,
Edward shrugged, laying back in the grass.
He was a powerful knight in his youth, as you can probably imagine. He didn't much need my assistance for anything. Between him, Rydia and Yang, they had the battlefield covered.
He smiled sadly in recollection.
Cecil is a good man, I was happy enough just to be by his side and learn from him, even if it was only for a little bit. He was far more patient with me than most would have been in the circumstances from which we were thrown together.
Harley brought her knees to her chest. She hadn't meant for the topic to go sour, she had just been trying to learn more about him. She didn't know too much about what Edward's life had been like prior to becoming king, his broken engagement with Lady Anna being the major exception. She supposed when she thought about it, she had never offered up that much information about her past, either, but she had just thought it never really mattered. Her own surge in curiosity was befuddling enough, she didn't like the way her stomach was twisting anxiously, and tried to change the subject.
Well, you know my feelings on the subject of violence. The world would come to no harm if there were more gentle souls like you, your highness. Of that I am sure.
She felt a seething heat crawl up her skin as the words left her mouth. When she closed her eyes, it felt like everything had suddenly gone into slow motion, she could hear each distinct beat of her heart reverberating in her ears. Ka-thump. 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 Edward looked over at her, suddenly sitting up in alarm.
What's the matter?
Hey?
And nothing. Nothing at all, my lord,
Harley stammered, bringing her hands to her cheeks. My gods, my face is on fire. He crawled over to her, sticking his face right in hers, much to her simultaneous delight and discomfort.
Your color does not look so well.
Harley scooted back on her rear, her eyes flashing.
I am just a bit tired. That's all.
She spoke the truth. All of a sudden, the fact that she hadn't slept in nearly 24 hours was hitting her hard. She could easily lose herself in the frenzy of study and research for days at a time if someone would let her. There had been stretches of days in university where her fellow students and ex-fiancé had to leave food outside her door just to make sure she was eating something. Edward widened his eyes.
There's no need to overwork yourself. We'll turn back. No.
Harley cried, turning redder.
I just need a moment's rest. That will more than suffice. You're not getting out of taking me to Baron that easily.
He frowned, giving up for now.
Let's make camp here to rest. Is that acceptable? Fine, fine.
Harley waved him away, grumbling.
But only for an hour or two. That's all I need.
As if to prove her point, she flopped down into the grass and slid her hands under her cheek to use them as a pillow, slamming her eyes shut. Edward stood up, trying not to laugh. It was fun and rare to rile her up since she was normally as cool as a cucumber. If a stranger didn't know better, Edward would put money on them, assuming Harley was the royal based on her everyday demeanor and not himself. He approached the entrance of the next cavern, calling for the guards to come back when they were ready for a break. He heard one of them, Joe, perhaps, grunt an affirmative from deep within the cave. Settling back down next to Harley, Edward turned his back to her and closed his eyes, letting out a low, sad whistle. Cecil. Please be willing to hear me out when I get there. Maybe you're just trying to be kind by handling the meteor yourself. But I cannot ignore the troubling feeling I have. I know I can be of use to you, somehow. We'll figure it out together, right? A few hours later, Harley opened her eyes and was greeted by the mid-afternoon glare of the sun. Her eyelids felt like two sandbags that had been left to absorb a pool of water, and she was freezing cold, despite her billowing black coat and the fact that she had been baking in the sun all afternoon. Her stomach churned angrily from hunger, but just the thought of eating anything made her want to roll over and promptly dry heave. When her vision finally came into focus, she realized Edward had been staring at her with his eyes half open. She could feel herself break into a sweat, wondering how long he had been watching her and wondering what kind of bizarre noises she was making in her sleep.
Feeling better?
She groaned, feeling every muscle in her arms twitch in protest as she hauled herself up into a sitting position. Perhaps I needed more sleep. I'll just have to catch up with my rest on the ship once we've reached the port. If I can't keep up, Edward will surely send me on my way back home.
Yes, my lord.
Edward climbed to his feet, extending his hand to hers. She took it gratefully, blanching at how the ground seemed to quake beneath her feet while she tried to steady herself. Edward watched her with caution, hesitant to let go of her hand.
We will arrive in Capo shortly. Just hold on a little longer.
What's wrong with me? Harley looked away, pretending to brush the dust off her clothes. I haven't done anything different with the exception of investigating the meteor. She shivered, pulling her coat around her tighter despite the soaring temperatures. That substance that was rotting the very earth itself. Did I contract something from it? I was careful not to come into direct contact, but... She raised her hands, gazing at her gloved fingers and biting her lip. I can't tell Edward my fears. He'll never forgive himself for letting me go in the first place. As they made their way through the last half of the waterway, the guards gave their report from their earlier exploration of the caverns while Harley and Edward had slept.
There's evidence that there's been other people here recently,
Toby said.
Old fires, some trash. And signs of a struggle,
Joe added, and Edward and Harley looked at each other.
Meaning what, exactly?
Edward asked warily.
Could be bandits,
Amy frowned.
We found some dark splotches on some of the cavern floors that appeared to be blood. No bodies, or anything like that, but if someone were hurt in here, it would probably be easy enough for a bandit to threaten them to keep quiet. It's their MO to steal your traveling papers so that they know where you live. Oh dear.
Harley swallowed, the sensation of which felt like she was eating sandpaper that had gotten stuck in her throat. No matter how many canteens of water the guards kept handing back to her, she couldn't wash the gravel-like sensation out of her mouth.
Well, if they are still here, they won't dare approach us,
Toby offered as consolation.
They're the cowardly type that only go after small fry that they think they can intimidate. If they are foolish enough to challenge us, they'll have their arses handed to them. Regardless.
Harley frowned.
There's a reason why they are doing this, right? Should we not evaluate the underlying socio-economic motivations for turning to a life of debauchery?
Toby's face twisted in confusion, and Amy made a whoosh noise, flinging her wrist over his head.
What Harley is saying,
Edward smiled,
is that we should treat the underlying condition, not the symptom, and try to understand why they are stealing in the first place. Oh, well.
Toby shrugged.
Why is anyone evil? Sometimes it's just a choice, you know. It doesn't have to be more complicated than that.
Harley looked down at the ground, and all Edward could do was nod. Have I met anyone that has ever been truly evil? Golbez and Cain were manipulated by forces beyond their control. Had they had the choice, they would have never raided Damcyan and Fabul. I'm quite sure of it. And what of Zemus? His planet had been destroyed, and there was nowhere else for his people to go? Surely there was a mote of light still left in his heart before he gave himself to Zemus? I guess that's something we'll never know.
We're making good time,
Amy's voice rang out, making both Edward and Harley jump in surprise.
The ship is not even going to be at port by the time we get out of here. I suggest we do a final supply check in Capo and get something to eat. We don't really know what conditions are going to be like in Baron.
Capo? The blood drained from Harley's face, although it was far too dark for anyone to tell. We're really stopping there? Harley's heart began to throb harder as the outskirts of Capo finally came into view. Pressing her fingers to her lips, she took a ragged, shaking breath. Suddenly, her legs had turned to jelly, and she wasn't sure if she could possibly take another step. The last day she had ever been in the village, it had still been pouring buckets of rain, such a rare weather occurrence that for a while, rumors were circulating the village that the sorcerer in black who had attacked the castle and stolen their crystal had also laid a curse upon their land. As impossible as that seemed at the time, even Harley half believed it in her grief-drowned state. Golbez had been a presence like none anyone in their village had ever experienced. If the world was going to be torn apart by war, there was no doubt he would have been the man capable of doing it. Since returning to the Damcyan region to accept her role as Edward's secretary, Harley had made sure to never once travel to Capo proper. The thought of returning to that one particular place in the world was still too much for her heart to handle. She could bear to be in close proximity to it, bear to speak of it, bear to help build it back up from the safety of the castle, but even after 17 years, her blood ran cold at the thought of walking through the village gates and not being able to return to her old house or see her parents. Whenever she had traveled on business with Edward or for the castle, she had always gone straight to the docks to get where she needed to be, which were situated far east. If anything had been needed in the oasis before departure, she would send the accompanying page to take care of it. Breathe. Breathe. She mentally chanted with each soft step of her boots that sunk into the sands. Unbeknownst to her, Edward had been observing her nearly the entire way, his frown deepening as he took in the seemingly familiar symptoms of an anxiety attack rack her form, an increasingly white pallor, shaking hands, shallow breaths. Some of her hair had sprung free from her bun and was sticking on the back of her neck, matted down with sweat. As she raised her hand for the third time to absent-mindedly take a sip of water from a bottle that had been empty since before they left the waterway, Edward finally reached out, gently prying it from her fingers. She didn't even acknowledge his presence, her glassy eyes were locked on the approaching village. Of course. Harley is from Capo. I don't think she has returned since the bombing. This was not perhaps the best occasion for a homecoming. Edward pressed his fingers to his mouth and thought. Harley? Why wouldn't you say something to me? When they reached the village gates, Harley paused, her eyes glued to the red cobblestone streets that were streaked with dancing sand granules. The guards walked ahead, trying to scout for the nearest pub and lost in their own conversation. Edward turned, biting his lip. His secretary had become so white that she was transparent, he could see the pale blue veins throbbing in her forehead. Harley? He asked softly. She uttered a moan, her eyes rolling into the back of her head as she fell to the ground in a heap of coats and hair. Her hat fell off her head and rolled away, revealing a silky pool of navy that spilled over her back and face.
Harley!
Edward gasped, sliding to his knees and pulling her into his lap. Her head lolled backwards unresponsively, her glasses sliding off her face and clattering in the street.
Your Highness.
Harley hacked so fiercely that the entire bed frame shook that housed her diminutive form. She gasped for air, her eyelids clenching tighter as Edward tried to bring a carafe of water to her lips. She sputtered against the liquid, and he watched helplessly as it dribbled down her cracked lips and pooled into the hollows of her collarbone. She had been stripped of her coat and her tunic had been opened as far as the top of chest to maintain her modesty. Despite her pale, nearly blue complexion, her skin had burned his hands through her clothing when he had nervously assisted with its removal.
That's desert fever, no doubt about it. It happens to people on long journeys all the time. First they get fatigued, and it hits the second they set foot on sand.
Edward took the sweating carafe away and looked up at the man standing next to him. He had been emerging from a shop when he had heard Edward's outburst, and had told the guards to immediately carry Harley to his home, which was mercifully nearby. He introduced himself as Nick Covington, and in a twist of fate, had even recognized Harley as one of his schoolmates when they were very young. Edward had not bothered introducing himself, he was too rattled by everything that had happened so quickly.
Desert fever.
Edward swallowed.
I thought perhaps she was just anxious about the trip. Unfortunately, I've seen it often enough to know she's exhibiting all the symptoms.
Nick frowned. His wife, Mayaka, who had been hovering in the doorway, nodded sadly in confirmation.
Then we must get a sand pearl.
Edward trailed off, and Nick brightened.
Oh, you know about those? I've only heard about them from my grandfather's old tales. He used to live in this house before he and my grandmother retired and moved to the Adamant Isles. They've treated people stricken with desert fever before. He told me there's a monster known as an antlion that lives in a cave near Mount Hobbs. Supposedly, you can get sand pearls when it lays eggs.
It's true, Edward sighed.
Antlions only lay eggs during a full moon. Their behaviors have changed quite a bit since the disappearance of the twin moon all those years ago. It used to be that they laid eggs much more frequently, but not so anymore. It was a full moon last night,
Mayaka said.
So surely that means there should still be some sand pearls lying about.
Edward nodded.
You could be right, there's a good chance that they haven't been all crushed in the frenzy of birth if the eggs haven't hatched yet. I'll leave right now to bring one back. Would you be able to watch her until then?
Nick smiled gently.
Of course. I could never turn away an old friend like Harley. You simply can't imagine my shock when I saw it was her passed out in the street. But you had better give up on the idea of leaving today, especially if you are crossing through the underground waterway. The rumor is that thieves have been attacking people there late into the night. Get some rest first. We can't have you getting sick too. You'll need to make your way north with full strength. That's true.
Edward frowned.
We'll get a room at the inn so that we're not in your hair. Thank you for watching over Harley. I'll stop by first thing tomorrow morning before I leave.
Edward brushed past Mayaka wordlessly, slumping down the stairs. Outside the house, Amy, Toby, and Joe were waiting, their desire to drink the rest of the night away now stronger than ever. Edward gazed up at them, sighing and feeling as if he had suddenly aged 100 years.
Let us get a room at the inn for the time being. Harley. She.
Later that night, long after the guards had surrendered themselves to a dreamless, alcohol-fueled slumber, Edward slipped out of bed, careful not to draw attention to himself. Glancing back only once to make sure the flowers he had brought along for Cecil were still sitting safe in the vase the innkeeper had been kind enough to lend them, Edward pushed the door to their room open gingerly, grateful to see that most of the candles in the connecting hall had been blown out and let in no light. Once he was outside, he found, as expected, that the streets were empty. Capo was not the kind of village that had revelry long into the night. Most of the residents were shopkeepers that had to rise early in the morning to attend to the surge of tourism that Capo had been blessed with since the opening of their port. Once the sun set and the deserts turned into a frigid wasteland, most folks were happy to retreat in their cozy homes for the night. But for Edward, this had used to be the most magical hour of his day. It was when he would sneak into town and meet with Anna, who had been forbidden by her father to court him. Edward didn't have to think about where he was going, muscle memory lightened the burden of needing to focus or process his surroundings. He drifted northward, toward the largest of the oasis springs in the village, where a garden bursting with desert blooms was shimmering in the moonlight. Nestled among the plant life were 2 opal-flecked gravestones, well cared for and meticulously manicured. Clearing his throat, Edward reached into his vest. If his dream from the night the meteor had fallen had been any indication, she would come, it was only a matter of time, now. Retrieving his harp, Edward absent-mindedly brushed his fingers over a couple of strings, the disjointed chords rending through the otherwise silent evening.
Anna. Tella. It's been quite a while, hasn't it?
His eyes fell over the graves of his fiancé and his father-in-law-to-be, and he began to play Anna's favorite song in his repertoire. The mournful, delicate notes that drifted into the crisp air were as familiar as being wrapped in a mother's arms. It was a song Edward had played every day since Anna had died. It had been his one unwavering hope that she could still hear his music, even if she was now one with the planet. Even as he had been drifting in the sea after Leviathan had attacked his Aunt Cecil's ship, waiting to die, her song had played continuously in his mind. He often wondered if his heart had acted as a sonar so that he could still transmit the music to Anna while half drowned. A faint shadow fell over Edward, and he lifted his eyes toward the oasis with anticipation. Sure enough, she was before him once more, just like she had appeared in his dream, Anna's ethereal skin glowing in the moonlight, her golden gown billowing in gossamer waves from a breeze that Edward could neither feel nor see.
Anna.
She gazed down at him, once more folding her hands together, as if to beg, and blinking the diamond-like tears from her eyes.
Anna. Why must you be so sad?
Edward lowered his harp, reaching out for her across the lake.
Does my music not reach you anymore? You can't possibly think I've forgotten about you, right? It had been so long since I saw you in my dreams.
Anna closed her eyes, and as she reached out to take Edward's hand, her body faded away. Feeling just the slightest brush of warmth on his fingers, Edward pulled his hand back, pressing it to his mouth and willing his tears to cease before they could spill over his cheeks.
Anna? What are you trying to tell me, Anna?
But minutes passed, and Anna did not reappear to answer his question. Clutching his harp, Edward turned to make his way back to the inn, when he heard a booming voice from behind that transformed into a bark of a laugh.
Can't even tell that, you spoony bard.
Edward whirled around, his eyes wide. Now standing before him in the oasis was Tella the sage himself, Anna's windbag of a father who had fallen in a battle with Golbez during the war. Wild white hair protruded from all directions on his head, his beard the only tamed mass of hair, which covered half his face and most of his chest. He reached up, adjusting his purple-lensed, circular spectacles as his garish trademark pink and purple coat fluttered in the wind.
Tella!
Edward cried. It was a testament to the precarious condition of Edward and Tella's relationship that even when long dead, Tella's voice could make Edward shake in his boots. Tella shook his head, crossing his arms over his chest.
Guess I have to spell it out, like always. Anna wants you to live, Edward. Live? What do you mean? I'm as alive as I've ever been.
Edward held out his arms as if to demonstrate. Tella threw his head back and laughed so riotously that Edward wondered if the entire village would awaken. He couldn't help but nervously glance behind his shoulder. He had no idea if anyone else in the village could see ghosts like him, but he wasn't exactly keen for tonight to be the time he found out. Tella jabbed a transparent finger toward Edward's chest.
Take a good, hard look at yourself and then tell me whether that's really true. What?
Edward shook his head.
Tella, with all due respect, you make no sense. You know what to do.
Tella jabbed once more for good measure, but of course his hand merely passed through Edward's chest. Edward blinked confusedly as Tella disappeared, a trail of blistering laughter lingering in the air.
Tella.
Edward brought his hands to his chest, staring down at himself wondrously.
What could I be missing?
The next morning, before dawn had even broken, Edward awoke and rushed to the house Harley was staying in without waiting for his guards to stir. It had been another restless night. His little walk to the northern oasis had not done much except give him even more to dwell and fret upon. Anna wants me to live. What in the world could that possibly mean? What would you call what I've been doing since that dreadful day she was taken away? When he was led up to Harley's temporary bedroom, Edward found her tossing and turning in a feverish daze, her cheeks stained scarlet with effort and her feet violently kicking underneath the covers.
NNNGH?
She groaned, and Mayaka pushed past Edward as she ran up the stairs with a fresh compress, pressing it to Harley's forehead and stroking her hair back.
There, dear. It's okay.
She looked up at Edward and shook her head.
1 minute she's burning hot, and the next freezing cold. Her body is all in a flux. I could hear her tossing and turning all night.
Edward felt the blood drain from his face as he watched Harley writhe in agony, and he realized after a few moments that Nick, who had been sitting in a chair in the corner of the room, was trying to talk to him.
The fever's getting worse. We need that sand pearl as soon as possible.
Edward bit his lip. He recalled the reflection of the moon in the oasis, and how it had already begun to wane from its fullest light of the night prior. Every precious second that passed meant the possibility of retrieving an intact sand pearl got lesser and lesser, along with Harley's recovery. Edward pushed his fingers through his hair, clenching his jaw.
I will get it no matter what it takes. Keep an eye on her for me, please. I'll be back as soon as I can.
Harley moaned at the sound of Edward's distraught voice.
Hi. Ness. I'm sorry. This is all my fault. Harley, you're awake.
Edward knelt on the other side of the bed, grasping her hand in his. It was clammy and cold, and when had her hands gotten so tiny? He could have swallowed it whole within his own.
Don't be ridiculous. Just stay in bed for me. I'll bring back the medicine you need.
She turned to face him, her eyes barely managing to open in watery, bloodshot slits.
This wouldn't have happened if I hadn't forced you to take me.
All Edward could bring himself to do was squeeze her hand. Nick crossed his arms, shaking his head.
Enough talking, Harley. You need to conserve your strength.
Harley turned away dejectedly, and Edward felt her hand go limp.
Please. Be careful. Harley.
Edward whimpered, releasing her hand and standing back up. The Ant Lion's den is east of Damcyan Castle. If I hurry, I can make it back yet before nightfall. He turned to leave, and was surprised to see Amy, Toby, and Joe standing in the doorway of the bedroom. They didn't look too amused at having been left behind at the inn.
You are traveling to the Ant Lion's den, yes?
Toby asked. Edward nodded, feeling like a child who had gotten caught with his hand in the cookie jar.
Yes. Let us accompany you, Your Highness,
Joe said.
We're ready to go right now.
Edward looked away.
No, I need you to stay here with Harley.
Amy blinked.
But, my lord, the Chancellor said.
Edward took a deep breath, and offered a smile.
Please. I'll be all right. If something happens with Harley while I'm gone, I want people she knows and trusts to be by her side. I know the Chancellor has my best interests at heart, but right now, Harley is the most important, this moon or this world be damned. Understood?
The three guards looked at each other, and gave a defeated shrug. Who were they to defy the king's orders?
Yes, Your Highness.
They parted from the entryway to the bedroom, and Edward passed through the threshold, glancing back at Harley one last time before disappearing down the stairs. He felt an agonizing twist in his gut as he stepped back out into the village streets. This is my own problem. One that I'll fix myself. I can't depend on Cecil, or Harley, or anyone else. I couldn't save you, Anna. And for that, I will always be aggrieved. But if the gods are giving me a second chance with Harley, then this time, I simply cannot fail. As Edward stared dispiritedly down the streets, he realized he had no idea how he should go about making his way back up north. He had been barely paying any mind to where they were going on the way down, his attentions had been focused on either on his harp to help keep the undead at bay, or, he realized with a burn of embarrassment spreading across his cheeks, Harley. She was acting weird the entire trip. Why didn't I take her back home before things got worse? Was my need to confront Cecil really more important than her well-being? He knew how to get back to the waterway, but actually getting through it was going to be another matter altogether. Could his music alone really fend off all of the beasts that had fallen so easily to his guards' blades? He was about to turn around to go back inside the house to beg the guards' forgiveness for his prideful foolishness, when he heard a commotion erupting from one of the market stalls a few yards away. Turning on his heel, he spotted two children, a young boy and girl who looked to be around the same age, perhaps 12 or 13 years old, arguing with an older woman who was running the stall. With an unexpected pang, Edward realized the children had the same exact coloring as Anna, rich brown hair that was highlighted red from hours in the Capo sun, yet their skin was inexplicably fair. It wasn't out of the realm of possibility that they were distant relations. Capo was a small village, after all, and Anna had never talked much about her mother's family. She had died when Anna was young, long before Edward had come to know her, but regardless of their identities, Edward couldn't help but find himself drawn to them. If Anna had lived, the future heir to Damcyan would have surely been their age now. Maybe we would have even had 2 or 3 children. Anna had wanted a big family. She hated being an only child growing up. And so had I.
This isn't fair. Yesterday the price was only 100 gil. Why is it higher now?
The young girl was near tears.
Yeah, why are you trying to rip us off?
The boy demanded.
I can't help it if parts are suddenly getting harder to come by.
The woman running the stall frowned.
A lot less vendors are going to come to Capo now that the moon is acting up again and there's the possibility of war. I have to eat too, you know. May I ask what the concern is?
Edward interjected, approaching the stall. All 3 strangers turned to stare at him, and he could tell by the looks on their faces that none of them realized who he was. In his opinion, that was all for the better. He hadn't looked in a mirror since he had left the castle to investigate the meteor site, so he was sure he was unrecognizable at this point. He had always found it simpler to move about in the public as a bard rather than a royal. It was so much easier to manage people's expectations that way.
We needed just one more part for our bike, and we finally got the money last night.
The boy frowned.
And we come here this morning to buy it, and find that the price has doubled. It's not fair.
The girl pouted.
Now it's going to take us another 3 months just to make up the difference.
Edward raised his eyebrows.
Well, unfortunately, this woman is not wrong. The return of the twin moon is certainly alarming to many people. You two seem young enough to have not lived through the previous war, but I can assure you it was a frightening time for all of us. When people are scared, there are consequences that ripple throughout the land, like a favorite shop not getting supplies anymore, because people stop traveling to other towns. I'm not worried about some stupid moon.
The girl frowned.
King Edward will protect us if anything bad happens. Yeah, my cousin lives in Damcyan Castle, and he says it's the best place in the world.
The boy shrugged.
King Edward would let us all live there if we needed to.
Edward brought his hand to his mouth, trying to hide his smile.
True enough, but we still must be kind and understanding to our neighbors, especially during stressful times like these. Is your bike broken? We're building one.
The girl smiled, brightening slightly just at Edward taking an interest.
And not just any bike, a hover bike that can ride over shallows in the sea or the desert stands. We've studied the technology used in hovercrafts, and think we're close to recreating it in a less expensive model.
The boy nodded proudly.
If we could just get this last part, we could finally take it for a test ride. It will help so many people if we can get it just right.
The girl frowned.
We were so close.
She stared at her sandaled feet despondently. 2 bright young children, giving Baron's company of engineers a run for their money. Beautiful dreams are coming out of our kingdom, after all. Edward smiled wider, tapping his chin. Perhaps this was fated.
I have a proposal for you. If I give you the rest of the money for the part, would you be able to get the bike up and running yet this morning and give me a ride? What?
The boy gasped.
It would take no time at all to finish the bike. Where do you need to go? Just to Damcyan. Would it get us that far? It should, if everything works the way we think it will.
The girl blinked.
Are you sure about this? Time is of the essence, and you would get me to where I need to be far faster than if I had to walk.
Edward reached into his pockets, pulling out a small satchel that he knew contained a well over 100 gil and handing it to the stall owner.
With their money, this should be more than enough, I presume. Why yes. It's plenty.
The woman shook her head in disbelief, reaching under a shelf out of their sight and pulling out a small metal cylinder that appeared to be bolted shut in the center seam. Handing it over to the boy, she tucked the money in her apron pocket.
This is it, a dynamo that has been infused with cherub down. My last one. I can't believe it.
The girl cried, jumping up and down.
Thank you so much, Er.
She scratched her head.
I didn't catch your name, sir. Just call me Chris.
Edward offered up his rarely used middle name.
Should we meet at the village gates when you are ready?
The children nodded eagerly.
Yes, Chris. We'll be around in a few minutes, wish us luck.
Best of it, Edward smiled, and watched as they ran toward the northwestern side of the village. The stall keeper watched him with her eyebrow arched.
You've really made their day, but it sounds like you have somewhere important to be. Are you sure you want to ride on that death trap of theirs?
Edward nodded, his smile not reaching his eyes.
I just woke up with a feeling that today, I needed to take a leap of faith. You doing all right back there, Chris? Just fine. Hoo-hoo. I can't believe we're sailing over the ocean.
The girl, whom Edward had learned was named Mariah, grinned back at him from the driver's seat, her oversized goggles slipping down her face. Her brother, named Reed, was sandwiched between her and Edward, his arms encircled around her waist.
Keep your eyes on the road.
Reed laughed.
It looks like we're almost there, I can see Damsion Castle.
Edward lifted his head, which he had been ducking to avoid the sea spray stinging his eyes, and saw that Reed was right. The tallest towers of the castle were cresting over the horizon in greeting. They had made wonderful time, as promised. It hadn't taken long for Mariah and Reed to install the part. Edward guessed that it had taken them no more than 15 minutes since their parting to roar up to the village gates on the hoverbike. Edward could immediately tell why they had given it that name. It did greatly resemble the royal hovercraft at its base, where thick, orange, rubber tarps were crudely tucked into a soldered steel frame. But instead of having 2 rows of seating, it was elongated like the shape of a bike and had both a fan and a propeller stacked vertically and exposed at the rear. With 2 of the passengers being so small, it was comfortable enough to seat 3, but Edward had a hard time imagining more than 2 full-grown men being able to fit. As they bounced over the shoals, Reed had explained that in order to gain the speed they wanted and keep the costs to build the bike manageable, they needed to lighten the frame as much as they could, and that meant sacrificing potential space for more passengers. Thoroughly impressed with what he had been shown so far, Edward was daydreaming about how to best fund a project to develop more hoverbikes when there came a loud sputter and violent dip that sent him careening into Reed. Luckily, they had just crossed from the shore to the desert, but a tumble into the sands at this speed wouldn't have been much more ideal than falling in the ocean.
Ah!
Mariah cried.
I smell smoke.
Edward glanced behind him, and saw that a thin trail of smoke was indeed rising from their rear. He couldn't tell from where exactly it was coming from, but he knew from the overview of the bike Mariah and Reed had given him that the engine was positioned somewhere back there.
Maybe we're generating too much power for one dynamo to handle.
Reed shrugged.
We had better park and check things out.
But before Mariah could pull over, the hoverbike made the decision for her. With a final, obnoxious popping noise, their vehicle came to a halt, blowing sand asunder as it slid to the ground and sank under their weight.
Shoot!
Mariah pouted, climbing off the bike and immediately running to the rear.
Something back here is definitely cooked, everything is covered in soot.
Edward climbed off the bike, attempting to gain his bearings while the children fussed over their bad luck. They weren't too far from Damsion Castle, and that meant the Antlion Cave was close by as well. If he continued in the same direction he had taken to get to the meteor, and turned south instead of north, he would run right into it. Reed had joined Mariah, and they were both crouched at the rear of the bike, twin looks of dismay on their faces.
It will be okay,
Edward offered, and they glanced up at him.
You should make your way to the castle, there are probably some people there that can help you get the bike up and running again. But what about you?
Reed asked.
You weren't heading for the castle yourself. No, I still have a little further to go,
Edward smiled.
But I assure you, you've gotten me here far ahead of schedule, I can take it from here. You run to the castle, where it's safe. I'm sure we will meet again soon. Geez.
Mariah flushed.
You've done so much for us. Thanks again.
She jumped to her feet, throwing her arms around Edward's waist. He hugged her back, patting her hair.
There. It's you I should thank. When things have settled down, I'd like to take another ride and talk more about your bike, if that's okay with you guys. Of course.
Reed blinked.
You're like our #1 fan, Chris.
That made Edward chuckle despite the urgency of his dilemma with Harley. He watched as Mariah and Reed started making their way to the castle, catching them glance back worriedly at their abandoned bike every few steps. When they were close enough to the entryway that he felt comfortable leaving them on their own, he turned in the opposite direction, lifting his gaze to the horizon. The sun had begun to climb yet higher behind Mount Hobbs, and Edward reckoned it was close to mid-morning now.
"Hold on, Harley. Just a little longer."
His heart racing, Edward broke into a run across the desert. Ignoring the sharp cramps that drilled into his sides, he tried to mentally map out the best route to take once he reached the antlion cave to find the area the beasts were known to nest. The last time he had been in there was 17 years ago with Cecil, and he realized that like most of his memory from that chaotic time, it was dulled and washed away by his spell in the ocean from when they were all shipwrecked.
But I wasn't really functioning even before the accident, was I?
He thought to himself.
After Anna died, all I wanted to do was be with her again. Cecil, Rydia, and Yang. They showed me what it meant to still want to fight for our world when we were together, but can I really say I felt the same as them? I never had their strength.
Edward gasped for air, clutching his side to soothe the stabbing in his ribs from running so furiously. He had reached the antlion den, his eyes starting to adjust to the darkness as beads of sweat traveled down his temple and splashed onto his shoulder plates. Even from where he was standing in the mouth of the cavern, he could hear the soft growls of the antlions emanating from within. Something was making them restless, the return of the twin moon, perhaps? Steeling himself, he pulled out his harp, praying that one of his songs could soothe the beasts if something went awry, and crept inside.
Anna, even after the war, I still longed to be by your side, but I was too much of a coward to do anything about it. To have to come home to where we had spent our last moments together, knowing that what had been started would never be complete. It was torturous. Cecil and Rydia fought on the moon so that I could live, yet I could still barely bring myself to greet each day. And as soon as I set foot in the rebel that was our castle after arriving home, the rebuilding of Damcyan seemed far too great a feat to end in anything but failure. It wasn't until I got Harley's letter that I realized there had been so many that suffered the same as me, or even worse, and they were still trying to find the good in this world, people like her who weren't ready to give up, even when everything had been stolen away. Harley saw something inside of me that even I could not see. Why do you suppose that was, Anna?
The afternoon Edward had received Harley's letter had been a rainy, dreary one. Castle Damcyan had not yet even had a roof that had been properly repaired, so he and the few villagers who had taken up residence in the remains of the castle while they made their plans to rebuild had to spend days of inclement weather holed up in the dungeon. It was underground, and the only part of the castle after Baron's bombing that provided any kind of suitable shelter. He remembered the sound of footsteps climbing down the dungeon steps, and remembered the flutter of hope in his chest, wondering if it was another volunteer arriving from Capo. The rebuilding effort had been going painfully slowly, almost to the point where he was beginning to flirt with the idea of giving up. To his surprise, it was two men that had emerged before him, one a messenger that he did recognize from Capo, and the other a member of the Red Wings, carrying a note from Cecil. He had opened Harley's letter first, squinting in the fading light of the dungeon's long-neglected torches. He was not quite sure at which point in the letter his heart had ceased to beat, but after he had finished reading it, he could no longer hear his pulse pounding in his ears.
To His Royal Highness, the future King Edward, 7th of his line. I am writing in response to your query for an individual to assist you in the rebuilding of Damcyan. We have never met, but I know too well of the trials Damcyan has endured from the senseless war that ravaged our planet. From my current post in Troya, I have witnessed the suffering of many, and have been a victim of the darkness myself. I recently lost my parents to inexplicable violence for no reason other than them having the audacity to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. The day I had to say goodbye to them forever, I felt no blessing from the crystals, my last trace of light extinguished. I became fearful that I would become a soulless shell doomed to wander the earth for the rest of my days, as limited as I felt they were. I thought that surely if the war had taken my parents, that my time was not far behind. After all, what could I have been possibly left on this planet to do if people far better and stronger than myself had already been taken to their final reward?
I had not realized until being made aware of your inquiry that perhaps it was only through bringing hope to others that I could in turn find it for myself. I long for purpose, to feel the crystal's light fill me once more, but I fear it is not something I can find in Troya, where I have been drifting from day to day without consequence. Perhaps the reason for this is because I do not belong here, at least not right now. Perhaps I need to be somewhere that I can be steeped in the optimism and faith of hearts stronger than mine. I believe that for you to return home to Damsion after everything that has happened and to raise aloft a dream from the blood and ashes of your brethren is the bravest act a man, king, or otherwise, can ever take. I feel there is much I could learn from a post as unique as this one, but in turn, I would need to dedicate my heart and soul to the effort. I want to craft my own vision of hope for the future with these two hands, should one feel I am worthy of the task. I've realized I can't sit around and wait for someone to build the future for me, even after having mine razed to dust. It is my firmest belief that restoring or enhancing a nation's military or their magical might will not bring peace and prosperity for all. It is only when a nation's heart is restored, the heart that is comprised of her people and her people's dreams, that the darkness will at last be overtaken by light. I can sense somehow, even hundreds of miles away, that you believe this as well, that you have a beautiful dream for the future Damsion. Most sincerely, Harley. Edward leaned against the entryway to the spacious, sun-dappled cavern before him, panting for breath. After luring an irritated bale of fell turtles to sleep, he was ambushed by a pack of yellow jellies and had been forced to flee yet deeper into the cavern. Had Rydia been by his side like the last time he had been hunting for a sand pearl, she could have zapped the creatures with a simple thunder spell and saved the day. For magic challenged Edward, it was a safer prospect to just run for his life, something he was grateful none of his comrades had witnessed, as much as he had wished he wasn't alone right now. He pressed harder against the inside wall of the new cavern he had entered, trying to temper his wheezing as he heard the yellow jellies slither by in pursuit, none of them pausing to investigate what had become his hiding place. He dared to glance over his shoulder, and saw nothing but a wet, sticky trail of their mucus on the cave floor indicating that they had finally moved on. He waited for a few more moments before cautiously pushing himself off the wall and turning to take in the new area he had stumbled upon. Millennia of erosion and desert earthquakes had caused several deep cracks to form in the chamber ceiling, from which sparkling beams of sunlight shone. Golden sand from the Damsion desert occasionally gushed through the cracks, pooling on the ground to make elegantly rippled hills that were scattered about at random. The growing he had heard upon reaching the cave was much louder now, accompanied by a frenzied clicking that Edward recognized as antlion fangs. To his surprise, one of the hills of sand shifted, and a baby antlion emerged, its exposed pincers shiny with saliva as its big white eyes bulged curiously. Scuttling forward on its four fossorial legs, muscles twitching, it bounded up to Edward, who could not help but break into a smile.
"Hello, little one,"
Edward cooed, kneeling down and extending his hand slowly. The antlion clicked its pincers in greeting, butting its flat head that had not yet sprouted antennae against Edward's palm. Edward laughed, gently scratching its scaly, sand-coated flesh.
"If only Cecil and Rydia could see how sweet you really are. The last time we were here, one of your ancestors was quite naughty, and I don't think it gave them a very high opinion of antlions."
The antlion sat quietly and let itself get spoiled by Edward's attention. Edward's eyes lifted toward the pile of sand it had emerged from. If its egg had been laid there, did that mean there was a sand pearl nearby? Yet deeper in the cavern, ensconced in shadows, there appeared to be a deep pool of sand that had resulted from a particularly rough earthquake, maybe even the one recently caused by the meteor. Several pairs of pincers were thrust out of the sand, clicking in the air warningly. The sight gave Edward a rush of unnerving déjà vu from when Cecil had saved him from being disemboweled by the antlion that had aggressively attacked them for seemingly no reason.
"Perhaps I'll check where you came from first,"
Edward said softly, standing up. The antlion huffed and scuttled toward the nest in the rear, which Edward hoped meant that it was just ready to take a nap and not call for reinforcements. Although the baby had been friendly, he still feared that the moon was already having some strange influence on the adults. It wasn't like an antlion to be so active after laying its eggs, and it was even stranger that some had already started to hatch. He quietly stepped over to the sunbeam and the accompanying pile of sand, keeping his eyes on the nest the entire time. The baby antlion began to burrow into the sand, minding the pincers of its mother. Kneeling down, Edward gently shifted his hands through the velvety sand, his fingers brushing over the razor-sharp edges of broken eggshells, ignoring the sting as they sliced open his skin. On the surface, something passed over the crack in the ceiling. Edward did not know if it was man, monster, or just a cloud, but the brief shadow that draped over his form as he dug sent a chill down his spine. He was transported back to 17 years prior, kneeling over the corpse of the antlion Cecil had slain, frantically digging in the sand to find the precious sand pearl that would save another dying girl's life. Cecil was leaning over him anxiously, his shadow encompassing the antlion nest, the juxtaposition of his demonic black armor and his crystal blue eyes, creased with ever-growing panic, filling Edward with the same growing dread he always got when he was fearful that he was going to let someone down. In the destroyed Damcyan castle, after Tella had stormed off and Edward had been left to sob over Anna's broken body, Cecil's request of him and delayed introduction had been blunt.
My name is Cecil. A friend of mine has taken ill with desert fever in Capo, and needs a sand pearl if she is to live. And for that, I've need of your aid.
Right away, just from the tone of Cecil's voice, as cold and aloof as it had been, Edward knew that whoever this person was had been more than a friend. Momentarily, Edward felt sorry for someone else besides himself. Could he ever forgive his own cowardice if he couldn't stop Cecil from suffering the same pain as he? The second letter Edward had received from the Red Wing messenger was a simple invitation scrawled in elegant calligraphy on a smooth sheet of ivory parchment. It was confirmation of two things that Edward had always suspected would come to be: Cecil was to be crowned the new King of Baron, and during the coronation, there would also be a celebration of his marriage to Rosa Joanna Farrell, his friend whose life they had saved. Edward had been simultaneously thrilled for his new friends, and heartbroken for himself. A wedding and a coronation were just two of the many things he would now never get to experience with Anna. Each time he made a realization like that, the dark urge to bring an end to it all would awaken anew. What could possibly be the point of surviving the war if every time something joyous happened, he couldn't lift the veil of despair that was strangling him? And could he really leave Damcyan even for one day, knowing the terrible shape it was in? He had nearly decided on the spot to just tell the messenger thank you, but that he wasn't able to attend. But Harley's letter caught his eye once more, and he felt something inside his heart shift. No. He could not let the darkness win. Perhaps there was another way. Edward's fingers brushed over something smooth and warm, like the globe of a newly lit lantern. Lifting his hand from the sand, he saw a shining orb of milky, translucent membrane rolling in his palm, still perfectly unmarred. A sand pearl. Edward rose quickly, holding the medicine to his chest and closing his eyes in relief. Perfect. Now back to Harley at once. He took care once more in stepping away from the antlion nest, not wanting to be perceived as a threat. His pulse quickened as he saw a pair of pincers inching higher out of the sand pit, granules spilling inward as an adult antlion started to claw her way out. Not wanting to risk an encounter, Edward turned to flee with his heart in his throat, never stopping once his entire journey back through the cavern. Once he was safely outside, he let himself collapse in exhaustion, reaching blindly at his side to feel for the few medicines he had strapped to his waist. He pulled out a potion, draining it in one gulp and giving it a few shakes so that any remaining droplets of liquid splashed into the desert sands, where they instantly evaporated. Gently pressing the sand pearl into the top of the glass, he sealed it once more with the potion bottle's cork and attached it back to his hip. There. It should be safe for now. He started the trek back toward the castle, wondering if his luck would continue and the hoverbike would be operational, but it was still in a heap on the ground, and its owners were nowhere in sight. I can't wait for the repairs to be made, Edward frowned. And if the bike becomes unstable again? No, I can't risk those children getting hurt on my account. I'll have to make my way back to Capo using the waterway. Turning south instead, Edward made his way back to the waterway entrance, drawing his cape tighter over his shoulders as mist from the thundering waterfall in the distance danced in the air. He could recall that the first few chambers of the waterway were fairly straightforward. He first needed to reach the underground lake, pass beneath the waterfall, and then start climbing to make his way back to the surface. Just take it one step at a time, Edward, he silently coached himself. Harley is counting on you. As he began to cross the first drawbridge that would take him to the path that wound below the waterfall, he heard the sound of rocks scraping and a snatch of laughter. Before his eyes could fully focus in the darkness, a figure arose before him, swathed in dingy grey cloaks with a slash of a sneer stretched across his face. In the fast-failing light that trailed in from the entryway, Edward could see the gleam of a dagger in the stranger's hand. "A bandit!" Edward took a step backward, and felt a sharp twinge in his back. Glancing over his shoulder, he saw that yet another stranger, dressed identically but a few inches taller, had silently slithered up from behind, blocking his exit. He had a knife raised to his lower back, and Edward had brushed against it. As he twisted his body away with a grimace, the knife snagged his cloak, slicing open a jagged tear. "How long have they been waiting here? Were they here when we came through earlier with the guards?"
My. This is a rare visitor, isn't it?"
The bandit in front of him smirked.
"Who would have expected a rich nobleman coming through here?"
The one behind him let out a low laugh, stepping closer. Edward jumped away to avoid his outstretched knife, and the other bandit raised his dagger, flashing it in Edward's eyes. He raised his arm to his face, clenching his jaw.
"Sorry, gentlemen, but I don't have anything you would be interested in." "You liar! What about that shiny thing right there?"
The first bandit nodded toward Edward's waist, using his dagger as a pointer. Glancing down, Edward thought he was first referring to his harp, but it was completely concealed by his cape. The bandit behind him snorted.
"Hey, yeah. That must be worth a mound of gold in the marketplace."
Confused, Edward patted his hips, but then the realization dawned upon him. The sand pearl was glimmering enigmatically in the old potion bottle, as polished and alluring as any crown jewel. Shaking his head, Edward protectively placed his hand over the bottle.
"Wait. This is desert fever medicine. It would serve you no purpose." "Ah. So it is something valuable."
The bandit in front of him came ever closer, offering a condescending grin.
"Valuable enough to give up your life for it?"
Edward looked down at his feet, glowering. He knew they were being facetious and didn't care about his answer, but the response had immediately bubbled up inside him, filling his lungs with a sweltering rage that threatened to spill from his lips. "Of course Harley is worth my life, you miscreants. But for the time being, I have to survive to be of any use to her, unfortunately for you." Edward could hear them creeping closer. Any second now, they would be able to pin him and snatch the sand pearl away with ease. Taking a deep, shaking breath, Edward flexed his fingers and dove straight for the bandit in front of him, preparing to throw him down in a tackle. If he could just knock him out of the way, he could flee before the other bandit caught up with him and try to lose them in the waterfall.
"Ah! What the hell?"
the bandit cried, thrown off guard by the sight of Edward seemingly running straight for his dagger. As he stumbled out of the way in shock, Edward slipped in a congealed pool of slime and missed on the bridge, his eyes widening as he felt his feet fly out from underneath him. Tumbling backwards with arms outstretched, he plummeted from the bridge and fell into the distant rushes of water below with a splash, the violent current swallowing his mop of blonde hair and dragging him out of sight into the churning undertow seconds later. End of chapter.